Hello, my name is Nadia Loureiro, and I want to thank the organizers and tell you that I'm very proud to take part in this event. I am a parliamentary advisor in international relations in the Portuguese Parliament, and I am also a PhD student in international relations at Universidade Nova de Lisboa. Right now, I'm in the process of researching and writing my thesis, whose theme is parliamentary diplomacy in the Portuguese foreign policy. So in this presentation, I would like to bring you an essay in which I try to do an epistemological analysis, hoping to get this type of diplomacy into the academic discussion. This is the agenda that I want to present to you. About the study object, I want to start with this quote from Alcee Hastings, member of the US Congress and former president of the Parliamentary Assembly. If so and lay consider diplomacy as war by other means, we must no longer leave the plenary room while the battlefield remains. So, in formulating this essay, I consider two temporal contexts, the 60s and the 70s, in which theoretical currents identify the existence of new actors in international relations, and after the Cold War, when the existence of parliamentary actors and instruments was recognized and cemented. So to begin right away, I pose the following starting question, which I will aim to answer at the end. How does parliamentary diplomacy challenge and expand traditional notions of diplomacy in contemporary international relations? To prepare the alignment of this essay, I have drawn up this theoretical and conceptual framework that will serve as a roadmap of my research. The starting point of the scene is the states, and in this variation there are intersections, namely the study of foreign policy and its instruments, as well as diplomacy, where within the different types of diplomacy, I will focus on parliamentary diplomacy. To carry out an epistemological analysis of parliamentary diplomacy and to deepen its academic understanding, I also focus in positivist and post-positivist theoretical currents. In the end, these intersections are intended to help us to understand whether the external relations of parliaments are an alternative, a complement, an instrument of soft power, or even an instrument of power of traditional diplomacy. As for the method, I consider it first the inductive one, which consists of observing cases in concrete reality and generalizing based on the results in a pure positivist approach, which will thus be based on literature review and archive resources. I also considered the deductive method by applying general principles or theories to understand and predict behavior and decision-making process in diplomatic context, as in the post-positivist approach. This method is realized through analyzing the discourse and narratives of diplomatic and parliamentary diplomacy agents. In the epistemological analysis, first of all, it is important to understand the concept of parliamentary diplomacy. The fact is there is no formal concept of this type of diplomacy, and there are different opinions about its origins. Most scholars have only looked at the phenomenon since the Cold War, as I said previously. But diplomacy exercised by representatives of the people, what today can be considered parliamentary diplomacy, is present since the dawn of civilization, dating back to ancient Greece, when the role and objectives of diplomatic missions were subject of open deliberation by citizens in the Polish assembly. It should also be noted that the oldest multilateral political organization in the world that's still active is IPU, founded in 1889. In a broader sense, parliamentary diplomacy can be defined as an instrument to facilitating and strengthening the existing constitutional functions of parliaments through peer-to-peer dialogues. The main objectives of parliamentary diplomacy are to promote mutual understanding through dialogue, sharing experience and knowledge, building trust, developing innovative ideas to address global issues, and strengthening the democratic legitimacy of intergovernmental organizations. The actors in this type of diplomacy are the President of Parliaments, parliamentary committees, MPs and senators, and to a certain extent, the parliamentary staff. The instruments are international parliamentary organizations such as IPU and OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, parliamentary friendship groups, cooperation programs, and official visits. About theories that can help us to understand this type of diplomacy, in the early stages of my research, the vectors of complementarity, cooperation, problem solving, and the influence of parliamentary diplomacy on international relations are relevant to be observed from a positivist perspective. The positivist approach can be applied to the study of parliamentary diplomacy by empirically analyzing the interactions between parliamentarians, collating quantitative and qualitative data, and studying the relationship between parliamentary participation and diplomatic results that impact the foreign policy. Therefore, the most pertinent theories for framing these subjects are the two-level game theory, neoliberal institutionalism, functionalism, pluralism, and the bureaucratic theory, which, although they are not purely positivist, they incorporate positivist elements in their analysis. However, some positivist assumptions seem questionable because parliamentary diplomacy can involve subjective factors and complex political processes. So it is important to emphasize that parliamentary diplomacy can also question some positivist assumptions, such as objectivity and neutrality, as it incorporates values, ideas, and political perspective, which can be considered subjective and normative. Given this framework, it is important to think that this form of diplomacy can also involve subjective factors and complex political process beyond the positivist approach. Issues such as trust building, political persuasion, and coalition building can play an important role in this diplomacy, although they are more difficult to measure and quantify. So, constructivism can therefore also be understood as a research-based current of thought in this research. At this point of the research, it is already possible to find some preliminary results. In this assessment, we can verify that parliamentary diplomacy can be both a complement and an instrument of soft power available to the state's foreign policy. We need to consider that parliaments already have the function of overseeing government actions, including foreign policy. So, by supporting political dialogue and mediation, parliamentary diplomacy plays a role in conflict prevention and crisis management and also helps to find solutions to political challenges at international, regional, and national levels. This type of diplomacy can be conducted through bilateral relations between parliaments or through multilateral organizations and channels. So this collaboration between parliamentarians from different countries opens a new channels of dialogue and offers a certain degree of flexibility in addressing complex issues. And we need also see that there is the fact that MPs are often included in official delegation during the state visits and international events, which can provide opportunity for parliamentary diplomacy. Parliaments regularly organize visits to other countries and host head of states of their official visits. There are also more formal arrangements such as parliamentary friendship groups, which involve regular exchanges of points of views between parliamentarians from different countries and embassies. The information obtained through parliamentary diplomacy also strengthens the work of parliamentarians at the national level and provides them an active role in overseeing foreign policy and the implementation of international agreements. One example of this is a national being a candidate for an international position. As governments are no longer the only actors on international stage, parliaments and parliamentarians plays a role as representatives of the people through regional and international parliamentary organizations in the field of international relations. Moreover, regional and international parliamentary organizations provide moral legitimacy for international decision-making processes. Many international organizations, despite not being formally linked, have their parliamentary dimension through international parliamentary organization. For example, Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe and also the Parliamentary Assembly of NATO. During the research, it was necessary to be careful of certain situations, many of which are the causes that lead this type of diplomacy to be little studied and known. The literature on parliamentary diplomacy is scarce. This shows the difficulty of parliamentary diplomacy in becoming, in lato sensu, an instrument of foreign policy with academic relevance. Also, to make a deep conceptualization, I needed to extend sources of information to other languages during the research, in addition to Portuguese, Spanish, English, and French. And I also needed to be careful in the relationship between the theoretical and epistemological framework, because the line between positivist and post-positivist approaches is blurred. Other circumstances that lead to little knowledge of this type of diplomacy are the discontinuity of parliamentary mandates, where the identities change the dynamic of interests. Once that party identity can have the ability to influence parliamentary diplomacy. There is also a lack of technical attributes and funding for parliamentary external actions, and also the high scrutiny from the media leads to a certain fear of promoting the Parliament's international activities. Some references that I'm using in my research. Finally, I want to thank you all for your attention. I'm available for question and clarification, so I leave my contact details if you wish to contact me in future.